Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David. How are you today?
Man, I'm not bad. Looking forward to the holidays.
I am glad that you're doing well. I am, on the other hand, really pissed. I gotta say, um, I don't. I've been thinking a lot about how like that gut feeling in response to different types of murder. Um,
Yeah.
and there's like the at the hands of the police, that's a certain kind of disgust and uh, feeling of helplessness. When it's political, it it's really angering,
Yeah.
in a way that like I it's hard to respond to. Like I remember this feeling about around Charlottesville too, like just that like I it's very hard to tweet at, say, like the things Tim Pool is saying about that shit, and do it without making yourself liable to some sort of suit or proceedings.
And it really is disgusting when you think about it. I mean, like the rhetoric has always been nasty, but we're not the only ones who've been saying this. A lot of people have been saying it's like this is where it ends.
Hmm.
Not even where it ends, but like this is what it leads to eventually.
Yeah.
And particularly like when you start talking the way that the right is talking about children, that like children are under threat, that is so encouraging to like really unhinged individuals to sort of take matters into their own hands. From
Yeah.
this to like the Pizzagate thing, right? And it
Yep.
doesn't matter how far from reality the claims that the right wing are making. There's always going to be an audience of people who are really willing to do really, really horrible things. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It's been really harrowing. Um,
Yeah.
the
I mean, and in
aftermath of this.
on the same weekend, some guy caught on video for the fourth time throwing a brick at a Hell's Kitchen gay bar here in New York, and it's like,
Mhm,
you walk like it felt like a sort of sanctuary at some point, but you realize like, oh no, this is the country we live in, and
mhm.
they're emboldened right now, and it is infuriating. So I just want to say for all the folks, be safe out there, and if you're, you know, I mean, I just think of like, I mean, gay bars and Fargo and stuff like that. Like
Mhm.
it feels like a bit of a siege. So reach out to us if you have any sort of, I don't know, anything to say.
Yeah, for sure.
uh, yeah, I want to do have a little bit of fun before we go into the Danny interview, which I'm excited to share with folks on Call of Duty. But David Sachs, folks might know him. He was recently profiled critically by Jacob Silverman, recent Sunday show guest. Check it out, patreon.com/left reckoning for my talk with David Jacob. On We did talk a little bit about David Sachs, but on VCs in general and the quiet political rise of David Sachs, Silicon Valley's prophet of urban doom. So this is a guy who put in a lot of money to like the anti-Chesa Boudin stuff. He's part of the PayPal mafia. Silverman shared this clip of Sachs and another venture capitalists and the way that they approach crypto, and I think it's very revealing. And I say we're gonna have fun. This is another very infuriating thing, especially when you think about people who might be underwater and having frankly, a dark Christmas because
Mhm.
it's sort of scammer. And these two guys, basically, and I was going to look at what AUM stands for. I remember, I mean, AUM, and I'll look it up, but they're talking about crypto earnings and basically assets under management. So I think they have to. They're talking about assets under management, so how much crypto they hold, right?
Mhm.
And they're talking here when they mention discounts, they mean the early buy-in before this stuff, like a say a monkey JPEG NFT is available to the public. They get in early, and then
Mhm.
that stuff gets sold to the public, and they're supposed to hodl, but do these guys hodl, or is hodling really something that they're selling to their rubes that they're scamming and wallet inspecting,
Mhm.
and building houses off of, frankly, taking their money? Here is these guys talking about this Solana, which is, as Jacob Silverman points out, Solana is a Sam Bankman-Fried related cryptocurrency. All these guys are trying to make a big noise, like, "Oh, the liberal press was too easy on this guy," and no, they were right there with him, scamming with him.
Chamath Palihapitiya, and I'm your boy J Cal.
Sax, I gotta say, I think your AUM is positively correlated with the bags under your eyes.
If you mean it's getting bigger, you're correct.
I mean,
Yeah, they're heavy.
good lord,
They're heavy, dragging you down.
that's where you're hiding all that Solana in your fucking under your eyes. Jesus.
You better clear that Solana position. What's your lockup? 24 months?
Fuck no, he's trying to sell it to me on text message.
Yeah, of course he is.
We're negotiating discounts.
I just had the founder.
Hey.
So just right there, right? Like you're supposed to have that locked up for 24 months, but he's already trying to shift it for what? Dollars. That sweet, sweet fiat. Give me that fiat early before all these other groups realize that this isn't actually meant to last. This isn't actually meant to do any of the things we say it is, except get the people who are connected flush with fiat.
You're fucking the whole thing up.
Bro, you don't think
Ponzi
to,
scheme?
I'm hodling. I'm hodling.
you think I buy
You're not
hundreds of
hodling, you're
millions of dollars
clearing.
of anything without a discount? Everything is a discount.
Everything's discounted. You want to clear that position?
So these guys bragging about they don't buy anything crypto at the actual face value that you rubes buy in at.
In an LLC.
Are you saying I got $1 billion of Solana?
No, bro, I'm saying I have one, but I bought it at a discount.
But you're holding, correct?
Ish.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, me too.
They laugh. I mean, that smugness, man.
Yeah. I mean, it's just
That's unbelievable.
that's the thing is like, I gotta say, Matt, like it's funny, like because we have been like on the crypto thing for a long while now,
Mhm.
and there's like there's part of me that like wants to have like some pleasure in like seeing the whole thing sort of fall apart, but you realize it's just like the reason we were so frustrated about it was one because it's very clearly a scheme and a scam from the get-go. But two, like the popular nature of it in the sense of like everybody should get involved in this, everyone should be investing in this, was always just set up to make those kind of assholes super rich. And like all of the argument about like democracy, like we're democratizing finance for everyday people, it was really just like, oh no, we're going to still play the same kind of game, but we just get to be the ones who are sitting first at the table this time, instead of having to fight against more like old school institutional investors, right? And these people are very connected. It's just trying to find a market where a certain select group of folks could eat first, and they certainly are. And it's extremely like cruel and nasty, to watch how even in a system like this where there, a lot of those folks have put some money into it, they're not having the same experience as your kind of everyday person who like bought into the hype of this new crazy technology that's changing the game.
Yeah. And I was always cautious not to predict like the end of crypto. Like I thought it could maybe, I just don't know. Right. But fundamentally it is what it is. And like, so when you go to somebody and say, oh yeah, those guys at the top, they're laughing at you when you say hodl. And literally they were. And for a shorter term than even I thought, like these guys are ready to cash out yesterday. They can't wait to get that shit off their books and have actual money. And that's all you need to know about this shit.
Yeah. I think that's right. So RIP for now, until the next, for whatever reason, some of that stuff starts to come back. I mean, it's been wild watching the World Cup, man. Because they have the crypto.com banners on the sidelines, like next to the Coca-Cola and the Budweiser Zero non-alcoholic Budweiser. They've been seeing those has been cracking me up because it's like, man, they must have negotiated that like a year ago. What I mean? It's just like not a good time right now to be marketing for crypto. But
in our wildest dreams, I don't think we would have thought it would splat this hard. And I don't know.
I mean, don't want to like after the fact, say I was making bold predictions, but the thing is, like, you always knew that once it started to get hit, it was going to be quick because there's no floor there. Yeah,
and also I'm pretty sure like you and I think like other folks mentioned interest rates, right? And like I think that it's not a coincidence.
It's I mean it really is like the thing that sucks is like I mean I've complained about what the Federal Reserve has been doing because it's obviously squeezing working people, but like that's the thing when you have like a dynamic economy that it like raising interest rates is really bad for normal people, for wages, for all these kind of things. But also the really, really low interest rates has like allowed all of these kind of zombies to sort of come forward. And it's been like a decade plus of this. And it's just like the kind of like shock in some parts of the economy that we're going to be watching over the next few months is going to be really interesting, because so much of particularly like the American like financial system was so addicted to cheap money, and
Yeah, I mean,
seeing that
it's
dry up is changing the game.
yeah. I talked about this with Jacob, but like it really is like our like last 10 years. Instead of Obama being like, all right, we're not throwing people out of houses, we're going to send this money that we're magicking into air, we're going to put that directly in the hands of the American people.
Hmm.
Instead, we gave it to these lords of innovation and bankers, and we have Elon Musk and David Sachs, jumping around.
You're so right. It's like, I mean, if you ever wanted like a good argument against like particularly like the American, system of capitalism, it's like, think about how much money has been pumped into the economy over the past decade, and think about things that like we desperately need, like a Green New Deal, right? And instead of getting that, we got like fucking pictures of monkeys and fake money.
Bro, you think China, like, can you imagine China looking at their like high speed rail infrastructure that they've built in the last 10 years, being like, look at these motherfuckers.
Yeah,
They're
no,
high on their own
totally.
supply.
I definitely would. I mean, it's it's just like, despite what Elon Musk says about rich people being, people who are very good at allocating capital, we're seeing very clearly that, the system just chasing after profit, as the number one and sole goal is not a really good way to run an economy of this many people and of this much productive capacity. It's really extremely wasteful.
It's a good thing we have to learn this at once every like 100 years.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Can't wait to do it again in 25 or whatever. Just the same thing again.
Exactly.
Space bucks next time. But I mean, talking about some lessons, we're going to be joined in just a second by Danny Bessner to talk about Call of Duty video games. And I think it was a really fun conversation. Danny is obviously great. People should be listening to the American Prestige podcast if they're not already. I mean, we'll get into most of this stuff during the interview, but one thing I just want to remind folks about Danny is like, there's a certain kind of like lefty criticism of like video games or like violent movies, or it's like, oh, this is glorifying the military or whatever, right? And it's like, fine, I get it, but it's like, you also don't participate in this stuff, so like, I don't care what your opinion is, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, if it's not for you, then it's just like, yeah, you're just finding a reason to justify the fact that you don't like it.
Right.
Danny's the perfect person to interview about this, because like, he's a gamer, like he's
Right.
playing these games and he's enjoying them in their own way, but also recognizing like the very worrying aspects of it. So I think it was a lot of fun, and so we'll get to that. And then this weekend, for patrons, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, we're going to be joined by our friend Pretty Bad Lefty, the Master Swoletariat, to talk about Matt's buddy Blake Masters.
Yeah, it was very fun. Sat down with Brandon, and Blake Masters crying. I don't know what you really like. Blake Masters crying caught on camera, so you're gonna want to see that. And it's gonna be fun. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
So enjoy all of that, and everyone have a good holiday weekend. We'll see you next week.
Peace.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David Griscom here, and really honored to be joined by a good friend of ours, Danny Bessner. You should know Danny Bessner, but if you don't, he's a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. You can read their work in The Drift, Harper's, Jacobin, and many other places, and is the co-host of the excellent foreign policy podcast, American Prestige, with Derek Davison. And y'all should subscribe to their Substack to get access to all of the bonus episodes. I'm a fan. It's probably one of the, I tell people I don't really listen to many podcasts, but yours is one of the exceptions. And it's always so much fun to be hanging.
Thank you, David. And thanks again for having me back.
Well, I want to bring you back on because, there's a new Call of Duty out. And you wrote a piece last year for The Drift called First Person Shooter Ideology. And there's a link below for people to read the whole piece. And I want to talk to you about it because I think it's a really interesting piece. Sometimes, I understand like why a lot of lefties sometimes get intimidated or annoyed by some of like the militarism or violence in video games, but oftentimes the criticisms come a little hollow to me, just because you're not participating in this culture. A lot of not you, but like a lot of these lefties who make these criticisms don't participate in that culture, so they're just sort of
Yeah,
looking.
I mean, I'm a gamer first and
Yeah.
everything else second. A Jew, an American, a guy. Gamer is how I
Exactly.
identify.
No,
No,
so
yeah,
that's
I
why
played
you're
video
the
games for
perfect
a long
person to
time.
get on, because yeah, as Danny just said, they're a gamer. And I mean, before we get into like Call of Duty, like in particular, I wanted to like ask you, like, what is interesting to you, like, from like a, intellectual standpoint, like about video games like Call of Duty, and like what they represent kind of culturally and politically and more generally.
Sure. I mean, they're just for young men in particular in the United States, they're by far the most important cultural product, more important than television, more important than film, certainly these days, more important, I would even argue, than school and things along those lines.
Mhm.
And I think that cultural critics don't really pay that much attention to them. A few reasons for that. A lot of them are just old, frankly, and they didn't grow up playing,
Mhm.
the modern consumer video game. So that's a really important one. And then I think that people just find something off or something a little dirty, for lack of a better phrase, about gamer culture in general. I mean, particularly after Gamergate, and people were correct to be angry at that whole issue. But it has sort of a sour cultural odor. And it is associated with young maleness, which is something that's inherently dangerous and violent to a certain degree, and that makes it's not such a wild thing to think that, but I think we ignore it at our own peril. I think the left is so interested in culture, because we can just keep on losing where it matters. That we
Mhm.
should examine this one.
And yeah, I mean, like, I totally get like this point. I mean, just like from my life, like I was always interested in history, and like a lot of that, grew out of playing games like Civilization and Total War and things like that. And not only does it like sort of get you interested in these things, like, like not to make myself sound like too much of a rude, but like you pick up a lot of like historical like knowledge, or like or reference points from these kind of games. So like a game like Call of Duty, which for a lot of people I think probably is, especially younger folks, like is their introduction into some of like America's like imperial adventures. It does end up becoming really important. And I mean, before we get into like the specifics about Call of Duty, like the stories in the games and things like that, I did just want to ask you a question, because I think this is something that most people sort of implicitly f- you know understand. But there's this kind of idea on the left that like games like Call of Duty are very not just favorable to the military, but like the military likes these things as like a tool for recruitment. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, I think just factually there are connections between Call of Duty developers and the military. From my understanding, some executives of the film company. Sorry. Some executives of the video game companies that produce Call of Duty have connections to the military-industrial complex. There's certainly consultants back and forth, and there was recently some documents released that suggests that they are strong connectors and connections between the two. And I haven't looked into it recently, but there was a military related Call of Duty tournament and things
Mhm.
along those lines. So certainly there are connections. But then the question is, what do those connections mean? So there's sort of the argument that you can make and similar to what you make about film and TV, by making some of the protagonists, even if you portray them quote unquote negatively, you're inherently making people empathize with them and humanizing them. That's not the best term, but I'll just use it now because it's early. And making people feel like part of their project and part of their story. And there's certainly truth to that. But I actually think that the ideological messages of the games are not as straightforward as they were when, the first few Calls of Duty. I think the first three, don't get mad at me if I'm wrong, but I think the first three deal with World War II
Mhm.
before they expanded into different eras and, alternative timelines and stuff like that. And so certainly the Call of Duty World War II games are very rah-rah patriotism for the most part, even though they do portray, the classic war is hell, but we did it for a good reason type situation. But when you get into later areas, I think that it actually has a more cynical message about war, even if the Call of Duty company is connected to the military, and even as the military makes use of Call of Duty for recruitment purposes, and just making the military seem exciting to young men.
Mhm. And I mean, I remember a few years back that there's a lot of controversy at like recruitment centers in poor neighborhoods, them using like Call of Duty as like, an enticement to get people to come and hang out before they could like actually be recruited. It's just like, oh, after school, you can come and play video games for free at the military. But I do agree that I think that, we should have a wider focus than just like that very specific kind of interaction between, a recruiter and a potential recruit. In the piece in the drift, like you write a bit about the Black Ops Cold War game, and if you just want to give people who might not have played that like a sense as to like what narratively you saw in that game that sort of rang some alarm bells in your head, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the game, as David said, is about the Cold War, and it's basically you're kind of you're associated with the government. You're effectively like an elite unit that travels around the world, killing various U.S. Cold War enemies. But what I found interesting about the game is that it really wasn't sort of rah-rah patriotism. It makes use of the classic Cold War trope of brainwashing and who's really on your side. Is your government using you, or other governments using you? And it's a pretty cynical take on global power politics and the United States' role in the world, which was surprising because when I went into it, I'm like, yeah, it'll probably be some sort of like vague rah-rah, but it's really, really cynical, kind of like a 70s paranoid thriller, post-Watergate thriller take on the U.S. military. But at the same time, even though it's incredibly cynical, it has like no alternative, or it has no way of thinking through what this might mean or what this might say about US power. It's kind of like everyone's bad, regardless of what side you're on. Ideology is kind of bullshit. It doesn't really matter what you do. Every man is out for himself, and that means you have to be out for yourself in order to survive. So it's a very cynical take, but it has no really positive, not in terms of like the effective positive, but it has no program for
Hmm.
what this means, how you might change it, whether you should change it. It's just sort of, this is the way the world is, and it sucks, and you've got to deal with it.
I mean, could you talk a little bit more about that brainwashing bit? Because I think that that's like an interesting history of those arguments in the Cold War, and also how it's sort of like replaying itself in the Call of Duty games.
Yeah, so brainwashing is a classic Cold War trope. I reference a book that I actually reviewed about it in the article. I forget the name right now, but people could just check out the article that David mentioned. But it's a way where people, feel disconnected in the modern world. They don't know who to connect to. They don't know who to relate to. They're not sure if they could even trust their own minds. And sort of between this great game between the United States and the Soviet Union, people find themselves lost, and that's effectively the trope that is replayed in the game. You don't really know who you're working for. You don't really know who, whether you are able to even control your own self. And this is, of course, exemplifying fears of fifth columns that were very prominent from the 1930s onwards in the United States, which helped lead to things like Japanese incarceration during World War II, the various Red Scares that occurred over the late 1940s and early 1950s. So this was a paranoid era, and I think this represents the paranoia that was at the heart of the Cold War.
But I mean, it is interesting to see how like the Cold War, even compared to some of the other major U.S. conflicts, is interesting. I think in the way that it's remembered, particularly in this game, but I think remembered by people who like didn't live through it. Um, as less of like an ideological struggle between like communism and capitalism, and sort of like a pure power struggle that was sort of necessary to happen. Like if you have two large powers, like they're just destined to enter into some form of global conflict.
Yeah. So, sorry, David, you want me to explain how the game differs from that, or how it
No, I
connects to
mean,
it?
yeah, how it connects, it would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no ideology in this game.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. That there's no, we're doing this. It's not even like we're doing this for America, let alone we're doing this for capitalism, or we're doing this for freedom. And the Soviet players don't seem to really have any ideological perspective either. So it's kind of interesting because just in terms of professional historiography, and this is trickled down to the larger culture, the Cold War is now portrayed very much so as a struggle between capitalism and communism and a real ideological struggle. I think that's less true after the early 1960s than it was in the 1950s. But it's interesting that there's no real take on that whatsoever, and there's even no real take on, sort of, David, what you were referencing, the classic realist, quote unquote, approach, which is that states that are powerful naturally try to expand because they want to ensure their own survival, and that means they're going to eventually come into conflict unless there's some sort of negotiation between them. There's really no even mention of that. It's kind of just a bunch of individual actors running around the world for various purposes. And the bad guy is essentially psychotic. He kind of just wants to have the Soviet Union take over the world, but it's for unclear reasons. It doesn't seem like he wants to usher in a communist utopia necessarily. He kind of just wants to take over the world. So he's a classic supervillain. So the Cold War is really just a backdrop in a sense, but in another sense, this is kind of an accurate portrayal of elements of the Cold War, where you would just have kind of soldiers of fortune running around the world, particularly true in the post-Vietnam period. And so it's an interesting reflection of the confusion that Americans have about the United States' role in the Cold War, the purpose of the Cold War, what that war did or didn't do.
I mean, I think it's also interesting to see like the cultural and political movement where these games came out, because like the first one, as you know, in your piece, came out in 2003. I mean, could you talk about these games as like as a cultural product of the forever war kind of generation that we've been living through over the past 2 decades?
Yeah, well, it's very much not that sort of rah-rah patriotism that was evident in the early Call of Duty games. I think it's pretty clear that there's a cynicism about the United States' ability to reshape the world through the wars, to reshape the world through military conflict and war. And I think that game really does reflect this cynicism. There really are no genuine heroes. Everyone is kind of a cynical realist trying to do what they can to advance their own interests or their side's interests, although it's unclear what exactly they're trying to do with either. And so I do think that's a reflection of the cynicism of the last 20 years of American war, where the United States failed to turn Iraq and Afghanistan, and you could add Libya and Syria and other countries into what was promised in the early post 9/11 era, functioning democracies that are liberal, democratic, capitalist states. So I think there is a cynicism about that. But again, what's interesting to me is that there's no alternative. There's this sort of what I term imperialist realism, where the game can't even imagine or even gesture toward in any way, shape, or form that things could possibly be different. This is kind of understood as just the way it is. The famous, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, but just replace capitalism with imperialism here. And I think that's reflected in its cultural product and a lot of cultural projects around the United States.
I mean, like, I'm just going to read that quote from your piece because I think it really hits the nail on the head. So what messages would the average 14-year-old take away from Black Ops Cold War, to riff on a phrase coined by Mark Fisher? The game evinces an imperialist realism that can't quite justify American actions abroad, but also can't imagine a world outside of a military dominant U.S. empire, right? And like, you can see how this can create like quite a cynical political outlook for young people. If like these are the kind of cultural products that they're engaging with, it's just like there are bad things that happen, but at the end of the day, it's just sort of they're destined to, and there's not really a good reason for it. And you just sort of have to live in this world where there's a lot of pain and suffering, just to fit a kind of, I mean, in this case, like a narrative of a video game. But when you expand that to like the life that we're all living, like the ins and outs of all of our lives as American citizens.
Exactly. And I think that's right. And there's just no way to imagine a different world order by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think that's why the military is okay with Call of Duty, because it doesn't matter if they're cynical about it. there's just no other alternative presented. So, if you're a kid who likes Call of Duty and you don't see anything that you could possibly do in the world, why not sign up for the military and just be out for yourself there, as opposed to be out for yourself in any other sphere of life? There's no sense of social solidarity whatsoever. It's a hyper individualist message, which I guess can also be connected to the fact that in a video game, most video games, you're playing as an individual person as opposed to part of a social collectivity. I mean, it's funny. Probably many people listening will be like, "Well, of course," but I mean, you could imagine, and there are games where you play in more collective ways. So just the very focus on the protagonist running through shooting has an ideological component to it as well.
This is people have to forgive me, but when I went to college, I studied philosophy, and I was really into a lot of these French philosophers. And Alain Badiou, has this really interesting distinction that he makes between what he calls the warrior and the soldier. And he sort of makes this argument that in the 20th century, we moved away from warriors to soldiers. And like, what is a soldier? He argues is like somebody who's fighting for like a collective, for like an ideology that you've actually subsumed yourself, in the sense of like you're fighting for American imperialism or capitalism, or in the Soviet context for like, Soviet, style communism to, build a system of global communism. When I first read that, I was like, that is an interesting idea that like, regardless of like thinking about the conflicts that people are engaged in, like understanding that there's a distinction between, a kind of like personal violence that's like, fixated on glory or heroism or these kind of things, and like something that's collective. But I think as you write in the piece, I mean, the individual shift of these fights is really interesting, right? Because it isn't just, carrying the flag of a certain side. I mean, it really is like your own personal narrative within this kind of chaotic, violent world.
Yeah, I think that's precisely right, and I think that indicates, broadly speaking, the crises of these collectivist ideologies. Not even collectivist; that's not the right word. Sort of collective ideology, even like liberalism. That could be a collective ideology that could help organize people. And it just seems like no one really believes in anything any longer, particularly the millennial and Gen Z players of these video games. It would seem weird if your main character was a true believer in liberal democratic capitalism. It would seem naive. It would seem foolish. And I think that is where you can get into this type of ideological critique of the game.
And like, I mean, just as a historian, I'm curious what you think about this, but like another game that I like to play, Elite Sniper, it's fun, you get to roam around and fight Nazis, but that's another one that's like hyper individualized. Like you're set in the middle of World War II. And as the story progresses, without spoiling anything, basically this one fella who's sort of like loosely attached to the US military ends up preventing global Armageddon and preventing the Nazis from developing like a nuclear weapon, right? Which again is like an interesting way to think of like a global conflict like World War II, which obviously involved, masses of society, but instead of, seeing it in that kind of sense, it's like one person's sheer determination and will, stop the end of the world from happening. So like, I mean, do you think that as a historian, right, that this kind of, I mean, individualism in these kind of conflicts is something that has, just sort of been created looking backwards, like retroactively, from the kind of current standpoint of our society? Or do you think there's always sort of been that in some of our romanticism of conflicts, like, these big grand conflicts like World War II, World War I, might have been wrong from the get-go?
There's always an element of it, but there's a big difference when you think about a Band of Brothers type show, which does have a single protagonist, but is genuinely presented as a band of brothers, or the classic US war films of the post World War II era, where you have like the guy from Brooklyn, the guy from the South, the guy from California, all coming together in a collective. So even though it's a balance, and it's the degree to which side is balanced in which cultural product, because even in those movies, you might have John Wayne or someone who is effectively the protagonist, but it's in service of this larger collective endeavor. And I think now you're less likely to have a project along those lines. Even if you think about something like the shift from Band of Brothers to the Pacific, that the Pacific really did center more on individual protagonists than the Band of Brothers show did.
Okay, so I mean, we have this critique of the narrative in the Call of Duty games. Why does it matter? I mean, are we just just being classic lefties, not wanting people to enjoy things? What are the stakes here? And why is it important for us to sort of understand these ideological components that are going into these very, very influential and popular video games?
I mean, I think it's worth just understanding what's going on in the world. Whether this will lead to any political change, probably not. But people should be aware of what are the sort of the undercurrents of culture, because culture both reflects more base material realities, but also shapes those realities in turn. So if you want to have just a general understanding of any society, particularly your own in which you operate, you just need to also explore cultural products and not just look at the NASDAQ or the Dow or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think this kind of stuff really is important because there is like a general, I think, cynicism in American society right now, both like on the question of war, but in politics. I mean, I've been talking a lot to folks about the failure of the Democrats here in Texas. And like, there's always this kind of idea that Texas is going to flip because there's a lot of people here who, don't like the abortion ban. They don't like the gun laws. They don't like the economic situation. And the polling, aligns with that like we are run in a minority kind of system. But then, the trick is that when you go and interview a lot of the non-voters, which is the vast majority of people here, they say like, yeah, I want, to tax the rich. Yeah, I would like healthcare. Yeah, I would like all these things. But nothing comes out of politics, right? Like nothing comes out of that. So why would I go waste my time trying to help some guy's personal career who's not going to do anything for me, right? There's a real like, they always talk about voter suppression, but it's like very much like voter depression. And like, these kind of things like have a big effect on the world that we live in. And I think, culture plays a big role, I think, in cementing those ideas in people's heads.
Absolutely. It absolutely shapes visions of the possible, and visions of what you should do with your life. And particularly if you're spending hours of your life playing these types of games. And I mean, and these, I should say, these are the biggest games. They're they're purchased by an incredible number of people, and they're just played by so many people that they do have a profound, even though not one-to-one causal relationship, in sort of a more miasmic sense, shape how people understand the world.
Well, Danny Bessner, always appreciate having you on. People should follow all of Danny's works. We'll have links below to read some of Danny's pieces. And like, seriously, y'all, sign up for the American Prestige podcast because it really is excellent. And,
Thanks,
yeah,
David.
I
Thanks,
appreciate
guys.
hanging out with you so much, man.
Thanks, man.